When it comes to tragic Hollywood starlets, the story of Susan Peters might just take the cake. Many who encountered her in the industry's early years believed she was destined to become the next big thing, a rising star who would stand shoulder to shoulder with the era's most acclaimed leading ladies. Yet nobody could have foreseen that a single catastrophic event would derail all of her hopes and dreams. What began as an innocent, leisurely hunting trip with her husband, a time meant for relaxation and reconnection, would transform into the greatest nightmare of their lives. And even as Susan Peters fought for survival, her persistent misfortunes led to one of the most brutally heartbreaking ends that the entertainment industry would ever witness. Brace yourselves and grab some tissues, folks, because this story is a sure-shot tearjerker that unravels layer by layer as we peer behind the scenes of Hollywood's golden age. Born Susan Carnahan in July 1921, Susan Peters was the first child of Robert Carnahan and his wife Abby. Their home life was initially calm and ordinary, worlds away from the glamorous dream factories of Southern California. She had absolutely no connection to show business during her early childhood, and she lived a tranquil life alongside her parents and younger brother in Spokane, Washington. Yet this was no fairy tale upbringing, and the shadows of tragedy soon emerged. A family move to Portland, intended to improve their circumstances, would ultimately bring young Susan face to face with an unspeakable heartbreak. When she was only 7 years old, a devastating loss blindsided her. A car accident claimed her father's life and turned the family's world upside down. This horrific event not only robbed her of a beloved parent, but also set in motion a series of life-altering changes. Shortly afterward, the family moved again, this time to Los Angeles, where they joined her French grandmother. Unbeknownst to Susan, the very city in which she found herself struggling to adapt and heal would someday play a defining role in both her ascent to stardom and her tragic decline. Susan Peters never really dreamed of becoming an actor. Unlike so many starry-eyed young women who flocked to Hollywood studios with heads full of cinematic fantasies, Susan's aspirations were grounded in a profound desire to help people. She was a deeply caring individual and actually wanted to become a doctor, an ambition that set her apart from many of her peers. Determined to reach this noble goal, she devised a surprisingly practical plan. She reasoned that actors often earned good money, enough to provide for their families and, in her case, potentially fund her own medical education. So when it came time to choose between a cooking course or a drama class, Peters made a decision that would alter her destiny. She picked drama. It was a choice that might have seemed like a mere educational whim at the time, but it placed her on a collision course with Hollywood's complex machinery, where beauty and talent could open doors, yet where fate's cruel hand often played a larger role than any individual's dreams. No one could deny that Peters was a total stunner, and in the ruthless world of casting calls and cattle calls, looks mattered. In fact, it's entirely possible that her beauty won her that very first screen test. When a talent scout visited one of her drama classes and caught a glimpse of her angelic face, he knew he had stumbled onto something special. Even though her acting teachers openly warned him that she was one of their worst actresses, he saw something pure, something luminous and undeniably camera-ready. It was not unheard of in that era for a striking face to overshadow any initial lack of skill, as film studios were often willing to invest in those who could captivate the lens. When Susan Peters graduated from Hollywood High in 1939, she did so amid esteemed company. Jason Robards, Sheila Ryan, and Dorothy Morris were part of her graduating class. These contemporaries would go on to have long-running careers of their own. fueling a natural assumption that Peters, by association and talent, would follow a similar upward trajectory. Yet fate had other ideas. Rather than taking a smooth path to success, her journey would veer into unforeseen directions. Despite the later hardships that would mark her life, Peters' early career didn't start off all that badly. In fact, she found herself benefiting from kind connections and good timing. A family friend, writer Soliver Teal, introduced her to valuable Hollywood contacts, giving Susan entry into a world that was famously difficult to penetrate. One of these contacts, the influential George Cukor, took notice of her and decided to give her a small part in his film, Susan and God, which starred the inimitable Joan Crawford. This was Hollywood's golden era, when even minor background roles could place a newcomer in proximity to legends, where the faintest of opportunities might ignite a career. Yet when we say Peters had a bit part, we mean that she was barely in the film. She had no lines. She wasn't even mentioned in the credits. The job was simple: just appear in the background of a couple of party scenes. But for an inexperienced young actress still unaccustomed to the technicalities and pressures of a film set, even this minor task presented a challenge. On her very first time seeing the camera, something about the glaring lights, the presence of established stars, and the thick tension of a real film set overwhelmed her. She fainted, literally collapsing under the weight of her nerves and the surreal environment that surrounded her. It was a shaky start, but to her credit, Peters overcame this initial bout of fear and completed her scenes. Though her appearance was fleeting and anonymous, the experience proved invaluable. She learned firsthand the intensity of working on a big Hollywood production, and with that lesson under her belt, she pressed forward. Nothing truly good comes without hard work and resilience, and Peters understood this. She continued to do every screen test that came her way, tirelessly polishing her craft and slowly chipping away at her stage fright. Luckily for her, Warner Brothers, one of the era's powerhouse studios, noticed her perseverance and potential. They rewarded her by offering a contract, a coveted symbol of Hollywood's faith. In a time dominated by tightly controlled studio systems, where new talent could be molded into stars, and young actors often had little say in their career paths, Peters' growing confidence made her stand out. If Warner Brothers expected her to fit neatly into a preset mold, they would soon discover that shaping Susan Peters would not be so straightforward. Before long, after appearing in a number of blink and you'll miss it roles in several Warner Brothers films, Peters finally secured her first big break. But what the world couldn't know, and what no one could have imagined, is how her personal journey and health would soon collide with all these professional strides. She landed a small but credited role in a full-length feature film titled Santa Fe Trail, a 1940 historical Western drama that revolved around figures like J.E.B. Stewart and John Brown, featuring major stars such as Errol Flynn, Olivia de Havilland, and Ronald Reagan. Although Peters did quite well under the watchful eyes of seasoned professionals, her role didn't open doors to bigger or better opportunities. In an industry notorious for hidden agendas and shifting alliances, this lack of momentum seemed at least suspicious, if not entirely strange. Perhaps it was nothing more than bad timing, or perhaps it was something else altogether. Some speculated that Peters' increasingly difficult reputation might have begun to haunt her. The era's studio executives demanded starlets who would toe the line, and Peters' unwillingness to conform became a quietly murmured issue. After all, she had already clashed with them before. During the press promotions for Santa Fe Trail, she had locked herself in her room and refused to face the press because she found the interviews overwhelming. In later years, she admitted with regret that she hadn't been a good sport at that time, but in Hollywood's memory, even a single misstep could linger like a stubborn stain. Soon enough, promising auditions began slipping through her fingers. At one point, Peters bore the dubious distinction of being one of the most frequently screen-tested actresses at the Warner Bros. Lot, a record that underscored both the studio's fascination with her look and their deep reservations about her temperament. None of these tests resulted in a role worthy of her potential. Instead, she continued to receive a handful of tiny parts in some of the bigger films, blink and you'll miss her appearances, that did little to elevate her status. If it wasn't already obvious that some invisible hand was holding her back, one particular incident made it painfully clear. According to Photoplay magazine, Peters' screen test for 1941's Sergeant York, a patriotic blockbuster-to-be, starring Gary Cooper, was absolutely perfect. Officially, the reason she lost the part was because she appeared too young for the role. Yet that explanation rang hollow when the studio ended up casting an actress even younger, the talented Joan Leslie. To Peters' dismay, Sergeant York soared at the box office, becoming one of the year's major triumphs. This bitter disappointment crystallized the sense that some factors beyond mere performance were at play, factors that left Peters questioning whether she had chosen the right path and whether Hollywood's system was ever going to give her a fair shake. But fate often dances between cruelty and kindness. Just as Peters wondered if she had reached a dead end, another opportunity emerged from a different quarter. MGM, a rival powerhouse studio, and director S. Sylvan Simon recognized something special in her that Warner Brothers never fully embraced. They offered her a supporting role in an upcoming movie titled Tish, which began filming in 1942. This adaptation of Mary Roberts Reinhardt's stories brought together a quirky, sentimental tale intended to charm audiences tired of global anxieties. After all, World War II was raging overseas, and the public often sought comfort in gentler narratives. Although critics would later admit that Tish had certain merits, it failed to become an immediate hit. Still, for Susan Peters, even a moderate success felt like a welcome tide shift. The film's cinematographer took pains to ensure she looked radiant in every frame, and Peters responded with a performance so genuine and nuanced that she virtually leapt off the screen, commanding attention despite a role that might not have been considered star-making on paper. This success alone would have been reason enough for Peters to celebrate. Finally, here was proof that she could captivate audiences when properly showcased. Yet Tish delivered an even more significant gift. While filming, Peters met Richard Quinn, a man who entered her life at precisely the moment she needed human connection and validation. Even more intriguingly, in the movie, he played the role of her love interest, an on-screen pairing that translated effortlessly into off-screen sparks. Their chemistry was undeniable, and although Quinn was a married man at the time, they allowed themselves to be swept up in the kind of passionate affair that old Hollywood thrived on. Peters, now at the peak of her beauty and allure, seemed to cast a spell on him with her striking features and deep, soulful gaze. When Quinn secured a divorce, Peters dared to believe she was on the cusp of a personal happily ever after to match her professional prospects. In a period when the tabloids buzzed quietly about such liaisons, scandalous yet oddly accepted in the glittering Hollywood bubble, this love story added another layer of intrigue to Peters' narrative. For Peters, after tasting this personal and professional breakthrough at MGM, there would be no looking back. The studio offered her a long-term contract, a gesture of faith that she found both validating and thrilling. This signaled a new chapter, Her persistent efforts were finally bearing fruit. Better roles began to trickle in, and the next film she signed on to also featured Quinn. The production was doubly special. Not only were the two working side by side again, but they also announced their engagement during the shoot. Their chemistry, both off and on the screen, hinted at a string of roles that might anchor her as a romantic leading lady. Their work and relationship dovetailed beautifully into what would become her next big film, Random Harvest, a 1942 melodrama starring Greer Garson and Ronald Colman. Random Harvest would become one of MGM's standouts, a prestige picture that suggested Susan Peters' star was indeed on the rise, shimmering at the edges of Hollywood's constellations. Yet the hourglass of fate was quietly draining its sand, and Peters, basking in the glow of her recent accomplishments, had no inkling that time was running short. In November 1943, Peters married Quinn in a private ceremony held in a church in Los Angeles. Family, friends, and even curious onlookers gathered to witness this union, a moment filled with promise and innocence. Draped in her great-grandmother's wedding dress, Peters walked down the aisle steeped in tradition and hope, her future seemingly bright and endless. The newlyweds were over the moon, two souls who had defied convention to find one another, prepared to build a life in an industry where longevity and stability were always in question. Then, in a cruel twist that no Hollywood scriptwriter would dare to pen, for fear of seeming too heartless, everything fell apart in a single, catastrophic moment. Seeking a respite from the relentless pace of studio life, Peters and Quinn embarked on a relaxing hunting trip. It was supposed to be a peaceful interlude, a chance to breathe fresh air, test their marksmanship, and enjoy each other's company far from the city's prying eyes. They could not have imagined that this idyllic outing would spiral into the darkest nightmare of their lives. As Peters was reportedly picking up a hunting rifle for her friend, the weapon accidentally discharged. In a split second, a bullet tore through her abdomen and damaged her spine, transforming a tranquil excursion into a scene of horror and despair. She lay there, bleeding and terrified, experiencing a sensation that she would later struggle to describe. It was as if the future she had painstakingly assembled, her love, her rising career, and all her cherished dreams, had suddenly been taken from her, leaving her grasping at memory and hope as the world around her cracked apart. She was floating in the air, or at least that's how it felt, as shock coursed through her entire system. In that surreal moment, Susan Peters remembered telling herself not to panic. She had to stay calm. She had to stay alive. Richard Quinn wasted no time rushing her to the hospital, his own heart pounding with terror. There, doctors performed emergency surgery in a desperate attempt to save her life, and though they did manage that extraordinary feat, the victory came at a terrible cost. The bullet had damaged her spine, and with it, any hope of walking unassisted again. The diagnosis was final. Susan Peters would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. It was a crushing blow, and yet when she first regained consciousness, Peters appeared remarkably determined, as if driven by some inner fire that refused to be snuffed out. She even managed to take a few tentative steps at one point, rekindling hopes that she could transcend her injury. But a final checkup at the Los Angeles hospital led to a heartbreaking relapse. Her body simply refused to cooperate, and in the end, she had to remain under medical supervision for 7 long months. When at last the doctors allowed her to return home, the world she re-entered was no longer the same bright place it had been before the tragedy. Her future felt uncertain, and every small victory came tinged with immense struggle. As if these hardships weren't already testing the limits of her resilience, fate delivered another cruel blow. Shortly after Peters arrived home, ready to reclaim whatever fragments of normalcy she could. Her beloved mother, Abby Carnahan, passed away in late 1945. Abby had kept a devoted vigil beside Susan's hospital bed, witnessing firsthand the emotional and physical toll her daughter endured. Perhaps the weight of this sorrow was simply too much for Abby's heart to bear. The loss devastated Peters, who was now faced with navigating a profoundly altered life without her mother's guiding presence. Yet even as grief pressed on her shoulders, she tried to keep her eyes on the horizon, maintaining a sense of direction in a world that seemed determined to knock her down. In those difficult days, it might have seemed that no marriage could withstand the strain of such misfortune. Yet Peters and Quinn stood fast. Against the backdrop of a Hollywood that thrived on appearances and whispers, their bond appeared to grow stronger rather than weaken. Peters often spoke glowingly of Quinn, insisting that since the accident he seemed to love her even more. She painted a picture of him as a wonderful caretaker, always by her side, praising his devotion in a tone that suggested her gratitude went beyond words. Quinn, in return, did not hesitate to declare his admiration for his wife's newfound courage, claiming she looked more beautiful than ever, and that her magnificent attitude illuminated every corner of their life together. They were determined not to let the wheelchair define her worth or limit their future. Before the accident, Peters had once declared her intention to work for a while longer in Hollywood, then retire to raise a large family. Both she and Quinn had dreamed of a home filled with children's laughter, but the catastrophic injury meant that Peters could not carry a child, forcing them to confront a painful reality. Undeterred, they turned to adoption. In April 1946, the couple welcomed a 10-day-old baby boy whom they named Timothy into their lives. For Peters, who had yearned to nurture and love a child of her own, this moment carried a poignant blend of relief and renewal. In interviews, she expressed gratitude, citing that God always leaves a loophole to crawl through when trouble strikes. Even as the world changed around them, Susan Peters refused to relinquish her will to live and find meaning. One writer at Photoplay magazine captured the spirit in her wide gray eyes, likening her courage to that of wounded officers returning from the battlefields of World War II. This was the mid-1940s, after all, a time when so many men came home with scars both visible and hidden, and perhaps the public could sense in Peters' struggle a universal narrative of resilience and reinvention. There was a depth to her that was hard to ignore. She had ample ideas swirling in her mind, never content to remain idle. Peters contemplated work in radio, envisioning ways to command the audience's imagination with her voice, now that her mobility was limited. She took pen to paper, writing a series of articles for Photoplay about her Hollywood friends and acquaintances. Beyond that, what she wanted most of all was to get back to acting. Hollywood, however, often showed little mercy to those who did not fit its rigid, romanticized mold. Peters had imaginative proposals that called for nuanced storytelling. She floated the idea of starring in a biopic about Connie Boswell, a popular jazz singer who, despite being paralyzed from the waist down due to childhood polio and in some accounts a fall, managed to captivate audiences throughout the 1930s and 1940s with her extraordinary voice. If Boswell's resilience could inspire millions, why couldn't Peters' story do the same? Alternatively, Peters suggested a film based on the work of the bedridden journalist Nellie Revel, a writer who managed to influence public opinion without ever leaving her room, demonstrating that physical limitations need not silence important voices. Such roles, Peters argued, would not only showcase her abilities but also highlight stories rarely told, stories of individuals who overcame unimaginable challenges. Yet her original studio was not moved by these innovative pitches. They turned her down bluntly, as if the industry could not fathom how to weave a narrative around a woman who used a wheelchair. The boldness that had once characterized Peters's early career now reemerged in a different form. Rather than accept their refusal, she broke her contract, a daring move that required the same grit she had shown when first stepping into the spotlight. With her determination unwavering, Peters approached Columbia Pictures, hoping for a fresh start. This time, when she spoke, the studio listened. She proposed starring in an adaptation of The Sign of the Ram, a novel focused on a disabled woman who wields her condition as a means to manipulate the people around her. It was a role pregnant with emotional complexity, moral ambiguities, and dramatic tension. It offered none of the simple sympathy or one-dimensional portrayals that too often define characters with disabilities. Instead, it promised to tap into a rich vein of emotional range, something Peters knew she could deliver. It was as if all her experiences, her personal tragedies, the love and disappointment, the battles with studio executives, had led her to this point, a chance to prove that a wheelchair did not confine her talent, and that within her there still burned the soul of a star capable of commanding the silver screen.